Before that, we focus our attention on another kind of table where the action is of the verbal variety. Peter Sissons welcomes tonight's guests for Question Time.
Good evening and welcome to Question Time, which tonight comes from Scotland. We're sitting in the City Hall in Glasgow, European City of Culture 1990, poised for our usual hour of spontaneous debate and cultured argument before a cross-section of the public on matters which are of interest and concern to them. Around the table with me tonight are the Right Honourable George Younger MP, who was Margaret Thatcher's Secretary of State for Scotland for 7 years, the longest time anyone has held that office. He was subsequently Defence Secretary for 3 years before deciding to leave the government last year and re-emerging briefly to mastermind, if indeed it needed masterminding, Mrs Thatcher's leadership campaign against Sir Anthony Meyer. George Younger comes from a famous Scottish brewing family in which he is the son and heir of a Viscount. At the Scottish office, one commentator described him as a highly successful practitioner of wet Toryism. At Defence, it was observed no one was less likely to dress up in a flak jacket for a photo call. The Right Honourable Paddy Ashdown MP is leader of the Liberal Democrats. Paddy Ashdown came into politics after a glittering career in the Marines and 10 years in the diplomatic service and industry. He's been described as the only charismatic Liberal answer to David Owen, and is notorious for his restless energy and fitness, big advantages in any politician. All his survival techniques, however, will be called upon as his party is squeezed by nationalists, Greens, and post-perestroika Labour. I don't have to tell this audience that getting on for half Paddy Ashdown's MPs sit for Scottish seats. Margaret Ewing MP is the leader of the 4 Scottish nationalist MPs at Westminster, where she sits for the seat previously held by her formidable mother-in-law, Winnie Ewing. Margaret Ewing joined the Scottish National Party at Strathclyde University and won her first Westminster seat by only 22 votes. Despite being described as witty and convivial, she's poured scorn on Labour and Tories alike over their Scottish policies, condemning the present Scottish Secretary as no more than a Governor-General, and Labour's Scottish MPs as the feeble 50, since reduced, of course, to 49. Frank Dobson MP is Labour's frontbench spokesman on energy. He's a Yorkshireman who sits for an inner London seat. He's also been his party's health spokesman and shadow leader of the Commons. He worked before all that for 15 years in the electricity industry, for the local government ombudsman, and was leader of Camden Council. Most observers are struck by his fearsome laugh, and one described him as half Old Testament prophet, half David Bellamy. They're here to answer your questions, the first of which comes from Moira Leonard, who's a Building Society branch manager. Moira Leonard.
In the light of recent reports that 30% of Glasgow's population are to receive summary warrants for non-payment of the poll tax, would the panel consider that the system is unenforceable?
I would explain to our non-Scottish audience that a summary warrant provides for the seizure of assets for non-payment of debt. Margaret Ewing.
Yes, I think it's becoming increasingly clear that there is a non-payment campaign in Scotland which will be very difficult to defeat. There are, after all, only 139 sheriff officers for the whole of Scotland, and I have visions of these people at the age of 80 trundling round, still trying to reclaim the poll tax payment for the year 1989-90. Obviously, it's an administratively complex tax. I think even people who may have agreed with the tax as a tax, a very small number of people who agreed with it, would admit that it has become administratively a nightmare for people trying to seek rebates, exemptions, and all the rest of it. I think it is unenforceable. I'm glad that the non-payment campaign is sending such a clear message back to Mrs Thatcher that not only did we deliver a verdict at the last election when 11 Conservatives lost their seat, that the people of Scotland are prepared to stand up against a tax which has no mandate.
And tomorrow you're introducing a bill to try to ban the so-called warrant sales?
Yes, indeed I am. I believe, though, that the government whips have put out a message that the previous bill be kept going until 2:30 to prevent my bill being reached. And I think that would be unforgivable. And I think it is worth remembering that in warrant sales, the last figures showed that only in 3% of actual warrant sales for domestic debt was the full sum recovered. So they're not even an effective way of collecting debt.
These are sales of household contents.
Yes, the goods are what we call pinded in Scotland. A value is put on them, usually a value well below their market value, and these are then sold to other people in an attempt to recoup the debt. It's a very barbaric way of collecting debt in Scotland. There are other ways of doing it through wage arrestment or arrestment of bank accounts, and I think we should be giving a lead in this in Scotland and putting an end to a system of debt collection which really belongs to the Victorian era.
Frank Dobson, and perhaps you would tell us how, if Labour got a chance to vote on Margaret Ewing's bill, you would in fact vote.
Well, let's start off with the poll tax is a Tory tax imposed initially on the people of Scotland to use Scotland as a test bed, a trial run before it was imposed on the people of England and Wales. Everybody who had a grain of sense recognised that it was an unfair tax, indeed a wicked tax. And most people also said that it would be virtually impossible to collect. It would be impossible to collect because it's administratively difficult to collect, because people move about, unlike houses and buildings, which was the previous local government tax arrangement. The other thing was that a lot of people would simply not be able to pay the poll tax. Now, I have no idea what proportion of people who haven't paid in Scotland haven't paid because they are determined not to pay, or haven't paid because they can't afford it. But it was always a stupid tax as well as a most unfair tax. And I know a lot of modern Tories these days, or people who call themselves modern Tories, including some of the modern Tories in Scotland, are always going on about Adam Smith, and they set up the Adam Smith Institute. Well, Adam Smith, that great Scottish economist, actually said that there were three basic requirements for a reasonable tax. One was that it should be related to people's ability to pay, which the poll tax isn't, and the second is that it should be easy and cheap to collect, which the poll tax isn't. He also said you ought to know at the beginning of the year what your liability would be, and admittedly the poll tax meets that requirement, but it is a ridiculous tax, and it's a most unfair tax. And
where do you stand on these warrant sales?
Well, it's a matter that I honestly have not considered, and I would take advice from my Scottish colleagues on what we should do about it. If Margaret's bill ever gets onto the floor of the House, but I'm sure it won't, because George's colleagues will make sure that it doesn't.
But as a general principle, do you think it is that the poll tax should be enforced by selling, at the very last resort, the contents of somebody's house?
No, I certainly don't, personally.
Paddy Ashdown.
Well, I mean, I'm tempted to pick up Frank Dobson because, of course, the poll tax is monstrous. There is, Peter, only one other nation on earth that has the poll tax, and that's Papua New Guinea, and they're getting rid of it. Now, you may think that there is some reason for having a poll tax if you are a nation that has a tradition, if not the modern practice, and they don't have the modern practice of headhunting, but I think it is an idiotic tax. The question that we were asked was it enforceable? Of course it's enforceable, at a price, but it's a price that is going to have to be paid by the poor, by those who are at the bottom end of the scale, by those who are on fixed incomes, and of course by every single poll tax payer, because it's going to be immeasurably more expensive to raise. And therefore all of us in my own constituency, and I'm sure it's the same in Scotland, are having to pay something like £5 or £6 a head for the extra cost just of raising the poll tax. It has to be said that the old rating system was about as unfair, unjust and inefficient as you could conceivably get, and it would be very difficult to find one that was more unfair, unjust and inefficient, but the government have succeeded with the poll tax. But let me just say this to Frank Dobson, that his idea, the Tories bloody with the poll tax now. They've lost in the polls in Scotland, they're going to lose in the polls in Britain, they don't know where to turn, they're onto a surefire loser. And what happens? The Labour Party gallops over the hill to their rescue with the roof tax. I mean, I have never seen, I have personally never seen such a relief, a look of relief spread across Tory MPs' faces since the relief of Mafeking when this lot arrived. And you know, the extraordinary thing about this roof tax, which is just a return to the old...
This is the tax on
rates.
Capital
That's
values.
Right. The Labour Party is extraordinary. I mean, when their previous local government man came into office, he said, I looked in the cupboard for something as an alternative to rates, and the cupboard was bare. Well, since then, the Labour Party have put there 2 skeletons, and now they've come up with a 3rd. And the extraordinary thing that Frank Dobson says, he says that the Conservatives have tried this out in Scotland. And what are the Labour Party going to do with the roof tax? They're going to try it out on Scotland first. Actually, Donald Dewar, I think, has been quite honest about this. He said it was really important that we came out with this before the May elections in Scotland. It's very interesting to know that the Labour Party in Britain, in England, has refused to come out with it before the May election because they are prepared to keep people in the dark about it. It's a mad scheme. It's not quite as mad as the poll tax, but very nearly.
George Younger.
Well, I wonder if we might start by having a look at 1 or 2 facts. There was a survey, an independent survey, published in the papers this week about Strathclyde region, where we are this evening, in the middle of Strathclyde region. And a year ago, the survey showed there were 80% of people in Strathclyde region who had paid their rates in full by this time. And we understand from the same survey that just about now, a year later exactly, there are 78% of the people in Strathclyde region who have already paid their community charge in full. So that is the first interesting. And so the questioner has asked a very valid question, but it, from those facts, doesn't appear that the payment of the tax is much different this year from last, unless you regard 2 percentage points as being
How
very
does
different.
that compare with the figure for Scotland as a whole? Because we're told that more than 500,000 defaulters have received or will soon receive poll tax warrants. Now, does that bear comparison with what was happening under the rating system?
Well, what
over the whole country?
What I haven't got is a similar survey to what I've quoted for the whole of Scotland. We haven't got that, but the question there is how many people had paid their rates in full in Scotland as a whole last year, and we don't know what that answer is. But I'm giving the figures for Strathclyde, which is the best one we've got. Now, moving on to the issue, nobody likes paying a tax. We have to have some form of tax, and we now have 3 forms of tax to compare. We have, first of all, the rates, which were here until a year ago and are in England now and are going to be replaced in England. Almost everybody, and Paddy Ashdown has just said it himself, the rates were grossly unfair and very hard to understand. We in Scotland have had 3 revaluations during my time as a Member of Parliament. Each one of them was more horrific than the last. I did my best to explain to my constituents how the rates were worked out and all this business about what your house would have been rented at if you'd rented it, which you hadn't, and all of that. Very unfair. Unfair too, and I won't go on too long about this, extremely unfair, particularly to single people, to old people, to single-parent families and all of that, because they had to pay the rates on their house irrespective of their ability to pay, which we've heard a lot about.
Can we talk
so
more
that's
about the poll tax?
I'm coming to that.
And its enforceability, and whether you would approve of warrant sales to enforce it.
I'm going to keep to the point, but there are 3 people who have knocked the poll tax all over the shop, and I think I should give an answer.
Lots more than 3.
Now, the second tax we have to look at is the community charge, the poll tax, as it's called. Now, the community charge is designed to put right some of those unfairnesses, and it does. And the community charge has therefore got to have a fair run to see whether it does not only iron out some of those unfairnesses, which it certainly does. It's very helpful to pensioners. It's very helpful to single people, widows or widowers, who pay less under it. It's very helpful to single-parent families, just to give 3 examples. So let's, by all means, criticize it, and everyone has strong views about it. Now, the third one we've got, and I'll come to payment in one moment, the third one we've got, which I won't say much about because it's clear that we all think the same about it, and that is the so-called local government tax that the Labour Party is going to introduce, which has been very aptly named the roof tax. There again, we shall be back to the time that a gentleman will come round and tell you what your house would be valued at if you sold it or bought it today, which you haven't. It'll go up and up and up, whether you're still living in it, as the price of houses goes up. Now about payment. None of us like paying taxes, and none of us, I would suggest to you, are properly, would be proper for none of us to be able to sit down and look at the list of taxes we have to pay and decide which we pay and which we don't. We'd all have a great time if we could, but you can't do that. And there are lots of people that disagree with lots of taxes. People who disagree with income tax, and with inheritance tax, with rates in the past, and VAT.
But do you think this poll tax is enforceable?
Yeah, I'm just coming to that. It is enforceable. So you can't choose which tax you pay. So the question is, if you decide not to pay it, can you be forced to pay it? Well, if you're not in the end forced to pay it, somebody, like any debt, has got to recover it from you. And the method that it's done by is just the same as any other debt. If you fail to pay for your television set or for your three-piece suite or whatever it is, very painful it is, and if you don't like the tax, it's even worse. But nevertheless, the money's got to be recovered from you. Can I make one last point, which I do think is not said often enough, and I feel very, very strongly about. I respect everyone's right to disagree with a tax, to dislike it, to argue against it, to hit it all over the shop and everything like that. But I do think it's quite awful of a political party to encourage ordinary people of not very great means not to pay this, letting them in for the most appalling difficulties eventually with warrant sales or whatever it is. It's a dreadful thing to do to people. And arguing causes is fine, but using ordinary people and threatening their livelihood and their money and so on to do it is a horrid thing to do, and I do hope that that will be cut off.
Now, I'll come back to the panel in a moment, because they're itching to come back on that, but I want to hear, first of all, what our questioner thinks. Moira Leonard.
Well, I just feel that if the price of enforcing the poll tax is holding warrant sales, then the price is just too high, and I hope Margaret Ewing's bill succeeds.
And gentleman in the striped shirt there.
First of all, warrant sales are a crime against the people and they should be abolished. Secondly, all the dire warnings about the implementation of the poll tax have come to fruition. We're only 9 months into it, and already it's totally uncollectible. George Younger's figures are a joke. I don't know where he gets them from.
They're not my figures.
But as soon as this goes into England, the ructions that are going to be caused down there is going to be huge. And at the end of the day, I hope that the Tory party will be unelectable at the next election.
Lady in the pink.
May I thank Mr. Ashdown for pointing out how unfair Labour's alternative is, and perhaps the majority of Labour voters in this area will realise that Labour is now no longer representing their needs. I was wondering if Mr. Ashdown could possibly explain his alternative, which will hopefully be much fairer than either Labour or the Conservative one.
Right, I'll come back to the panel now, starting with Paddy, and brief, please.
The answer is a local income tax. It's cheap, it does not intrude on privacy, it is extremely efficient to raise, and it was the conclusion that was arrived at by the government's own independent inquiry, the Layfield report by Professor Layfield in the 1970s. It's the sensible way to go, and with modern and computerization of income tax, it could be done easily. Can I just come in on what something that George said? Because I do agree with him. And I must say to Margaret, I have a lot of respect for the SNP. I agree with many of the things that they argue for. But I do think that standing up and advising, indeed running a campaign to advise people not to pay the poll tax is irresponsible for a political party and very nearly immoral. It's fine for the MPs like Margaret Ewing, who no doubt does it with an absolutely sincere conviction, but what in effect she is doing is she is putting the poor and the poorest on the front line of the barricades while the others stay safely behind. And I note that when it comes to the poll tax, her own authority, run by the SNP in Angus, is collecting it under the law. So it's fine to stick poor people out front, but the SNP is a few miles behind, quite safe, obeying the law, thank you very much. And I don't think that's the way a responsible party should go on. It's a tough tax, it's an appalling tax, it needs to be beaten. But it needs to be beaten within the law, not outside it, and not by encouraging people to step outside the law who are most vulnerable and in the front line.
Margaret Ewing.
Yes, there's lots of misinformation being used here about the Scottish National Party's campaign. We started out a campaign asking for an army of 100,000 non-payers, people who could pay but wouldn't pay, in order that we could give leadership to the people who are in these very dire circumstances. We have not forced anyone to take this stance. It has been a personal decision by each and every one, and we have ensured that people have been aware of the penalties all the way through as to what the implications of this are. And I do believe there is a moral responsibility on political parties and on individuals to challenge bad taxes, because this is undoubtedly a bad tax for all the reasons that we've already discussed. And the gentleman over here mentioned that all the dire warnings have now come to fruition, and it's been with some wry amusement that people like myself have watched the Tory MPs from the English shires squirming, who were quite happy to vote just before the 1987 election to impose this upon Scotland so that we could be the guinea pigs. And I think they have realised the lessons which have been shown from Scotland. The tragedy is that they're not doing anything to reverse it and bring in local income tax, which is obviously the real alternative, particularly for us here in Scotland with our computerisation at East Kilbride.
Frank Dobson.
I really have to respond to Paddy Ashdown suggesting that the Labour Party is in some way trying to use Scotland as a test bed for a future tax. The fact of the matter is that the Labour Party in Scotland, not anyone else, has carried out vast consultations within the party and outside the party, and the proposition which Donald Dewar has come forward with, which is going to the Scottish Conference, is intended to provide a tax which is a lot more fair than the poll tax, that is based on property, and every Western democracy has a property tax, usually as the basis of their local government system of taxation. It will make the majority of people in Scotland better off, and the people who are doing worst out of the poll tax will do best out of the proposition which Donald Dewar is putting forward, and the people who will lose out of it compared with the poll tax are the people who are doing very well. And I must say, it does get my goat a bit when George Younger's going on about, well, we've got to be concerned about the poor widow and this, that and the other, when, and I've checked on this, just in Scotland, George Younger is now paying $620 a year under the poll tax, and he used to pay $1,375 a year in rates.
I want to hear what they say. I want to hear what the people say. Then I'll come back to you. There's the lady in the middle in the red.
Living in a low amenity area and people living in a high amenity area, what are we getting for this poll tax? Are we getting a proper service? We don't receive that at the moment. And at one time, when you didn't receive a decent service, you could withhold your rates. Nobody that I know was ever threatened with a warrant sale. We got action. But now we're all being threatened with warrant sales.
And behind you, gentleman immediately behind.
I think it was very interesting to hear Frank Dobson say that he calls this a Tory poll tax. I wonder if Frank would like to comment on the fact that the warrant sales taking place in Scotland just now are being implemented by Labour-controlled local authorities. These warrant sales are not compulsory in law, and the Labour-controlled local authorities have taken this action against the very poor people in society that they pretend to be representing and to be protecting.
You've got a brief answer to that?
It's my understanding that they have not gone through with any such warrant sales, and there is great pressure on them within the Labour Party not to do so.
Right up the back, gentleman with a beard. Yes, you, sir.
Yes, I think it should be remembered that George Younger, when he was Secretary of State, said there wouldn't be any such thing as a poll tax. And the much maligned rating system, people could get 100% exemption, where people have been forced to pay 20% of the poll tax. So it's a myth that the poll tax is fair even to the poorer people. Right. They've been forced to pay 20%.
Thank you. In the white, gentleman there.
Yes.
No, I beg your pardon, up at the back.
Thank you. I think we have to go back and challenge Mr. Younger in his statement. I mean, I've read everything from the Beano to the Financial Times this week, and nowhere does it say that it's 20%, 80% of people have paid. The papers say 30%, and if the papers say 30%, I'm convinced it must be nearer 50%. There's not a million out there. There's a million that
I want to come to Paddy Ashdown. Put this question to you. If things are so bad, if they're so unpopular, the government, because of this tax, how do you explain the fact that the Conservative leader's gone up 5 points in the opinion polls in the last month?
Do you mean in Scotland?
In Scotland, from 21% to...
I always find...
From up to 21%.
I have to say, Peter, I always find it extremely difficult to explain opinion polls. and that's a very safe position in my party just at the moment.
Yes, it's up. The Tory standard's 21%, which is up 5% on the month before.
I mean, really, opinion polls do go backwards and forwards. There's a good deal of room for margin for error in there. I can't explain it. All I know is that you have now building up in Northern England and in England the same kind of thing which has been running politics in Scotland for about 8 or 9 years, which is, what do we do to get rid of that woman? And that is the most powerful motive force in Scottish politics, and is becoming, in large areas of Britain, the most powerful force there as well. Peter, can I ask Frank a very quick question?
It's a
very quick one. If Donald Dewar has, with some honesty, although I think not a particular amount of wisdom, come up with this proposal for the roof tax for Scotland, why is it that the Labour Party has got no replacement for poll tax and is actually now saying that it will not announce what it will do for local government finance until the other side of the May elections? Would it not be more honest to announce that now, or what is it?
No, it wouldn't.
Can you be very brief?
Well, he's asked me a question and it requires a proper answer. The people of Scotland have had considerably longer experience of the vile and stupid nature of the poll tax. And the Labour Party in Scotland is reflecting that and wants to get on with saying what we think the tax ought to be in Scotland. That's what the Scottish Party are recommending, and that tax should be decided by a freely elected Scottish Parliament, because if a freely elected Scottish Parliament can't decide on the local tax system for Scotland, it wouldn't be worth having. We think that the Labour Party in Scotland thinks that that's right. We are still considering things in England. We don't want a back of a... Yes, we don't want
to vote before they know.
We don't want a back of a fag packet tax, which is the poll tax that we've got now. We think it needs to be seriously considered, and we're going to seriously consider it.
And then you tell them afterwards.
This tax, Paddy, will be decided, the future of it will be decided at the next general election, not at any local elections, the next general election. And if the people of Scotland want to have a separate tax and a slightly different tax, perhaps reflecting the different experience and circumstances that prevail in Scotland, then they should be entitled to have it.
And George Younger, very briefly, because we'll end on this point. If this tax looks like costing the Tory party the next election, will you consider making a zero liability to the tax for the poorest people? At the moment, the principle is that everyone must pay something, but is that immovable?
Well, I should think it is. I would like to just briefly to mention that point, which somebody raised. Thank you for raising the question of rebates. It's very important, Liz, because the principle here is that there is rebate for the lowest paid people, as you know, and the questioner quite rightly pointed out that we now introduced a change, which is that even the maximum rebate still pays 20%. But what wasn't added is that the social benefits, the level of social benefits, was increased at the same time by a figure which was actually slightly more than the 20% was going to be, which was actually slightly more, so the benefits were actually uprated by rather more than the difference. And the principle here seems to me to be quite right, that the poorest people in the society have been made available, therefore, extra funds to help them pay that, and everyone, therefore, pays something towards the services for which they vote. And that's got to be a right principle. And it's a lot better than the rates where a third of the population paid the rates for everyone else, and that was grossly unfair, felt to be unfair, and seemed to be unfair, and this tax actually puts that right.
Well, we'll move on. We could go on all night on that, I've no doubt. To our second question tonight, which comes from the Reverend Roderick Campbell, who's a minister in the Church of Scotland.
Thank you, Peter. Mr. Gorbachev's reforms promise in the long term more democratic government. In the short term, they carry the possibility of serious internal destabilization. How does the panel suggest that we in the West should respond economically, militarily and socially to facilitate this changeover in the Soviet Union?
Paddy Ashdown.
I'm sorry, the militarily...
economically
and socially, thank you.
Economically,
Well,
militarily, and
what
socially.
a fascinating question. And honestly, it's a very difficult question to answer because events move ahead of us the whole time. And every time that you draw up some kind of response to what's happening, the world has moved on. And the bottom line that you thought was the bottom line has diminished. But one thing I think has shone through the whole of these extraordinary few months when the world has changed shape in front of our eyes, and that is the tremendous power, vision, charisma, and wisdom of President Gorbachev. And I think your question is aimed exactly as it should be. What do we do to assist this man to bring to fruition one of the most remarkable visions and one of the most remarkable attempts to create peace and democracy? And you asked the question militarily, economically, and socially. Let me see if I can answer them in those terms. First of all, military. The one thing we have to do at this point is to assist President Gorbachev by making sure that what we do is as non-threatening as possible. And that means, I think Europe will change shape, and I think we may even see a complete new security structure for Europe. I personally believe we will. But this is not the time to be saying aggressive things, destabilizing things. It's not the time to be talking about changes in borders. It is the time to say everything stays as it is while we pass through this period. And incidentally, it's also the time, in my view, when we say NATO and the Warsaw Pact, which in my judgment, in due course, will not be part of our future in Europe, but they do necessarily, through the transition period, have as far as possible to stay in place as a secure backdrop to a period of considerable change. You said economically. I think we have to provide, and the Prime Minister has asked this question at Question Time today, economic assistance to the Soviet Union in the same way, though probably not in relative terms on the same scale as we're providing it to Eastern Europe. In my view, one of the big problems is the conversion of their defense industry. The Soviet Union's defense industry now, I actually had a man called Yuri Kaliganov, one of President Gorbachev's personal advisors, in my office for a couple of hours, and he said, you know, I have to let you into a secret, we've never had a defense budget. We simply told them to build the tanks, and they built the tanks. In fact, I think he said the CIA knew more about the size of our defense budget than we did. We haven't any costing system. How we convert this over into a civilian market-led economy, I simply do not know without riots. He said to me, we've already made 100,000 officers redundant, and we have yet to make 200,000 more redundant, and they're without jobs at present. That's a very dangerous concoction. So there is something we can do to help them. Lines of credit, managerial assistance, new technology, technology transfer, and essentially helping to shift across this tremendous defense industry onto a civilian free market.
Very brief on
socially.
socially.
And lastly, socially, the more contacts, Peter, we can build up, the more contacts, social contacts, scientists, cultural exchanges, etc., the better. I have a strong suspicion that, in fact, in the modern age, relations between nations are as important at the citizen-to-citizen level as they are to the government-to-government level.
George Younger.
Well, we could indeed go on at this all night, but I will therefore try and be as brief as I can. Mr. Gorbachev, everyone agrees, is absolutely remarkable. I think two things particularly so. Isn't it incredible that somebody could have been brought up inside that closed system for much of his life, insulated from outside world information and comment, and yet decide from his own eyes and ears that the Soviet system will never work? He clearly decided that some time ago. I think that's astonishing. And the second thing is that having decided that, what amazing courage to decide to stir up the edifice of the Soviet Union, to remove the terror and the repression which had kept it together. Absolutely astonishing, both those things. Which brings me to the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union seems to me, if you look at a map or an atlas, even before what we see now, is virtually ungovernable except by terror and repression. It's so many different parts of it, so many different sorts of people. People in Georgia have long said privately, we have nothing to do with these people in Moscow. And so the outside parts of it are already showing sign of wanting to go independent and breaking off. And as Mr. Gorbachev's made quite clear, he's not prepared to use the tanks on it. It's going to carry on doing so. Now, what can we do? And Paddy is quite right, and some of the things he said about that. The one thing we must provide to help Mr. Gorbachev is some elements of stability. The one thing he doesn't need is us all running around and changing our views and everything as well. The last thing he wants is for NATO to disappear or break up or anything at the moment. He knows it, he understands it, he's dealt with it. It's a pillar of solidity for him as it is for everybody else. So we must keep our policy steady. We must keep the talks going as quickly as possible for reduction in armaments. We must keep it with them, keep discussing it, and once we get it to fruition, we can then reduce our armaments together with them. And on economic matters, we must keep as close as we can to Mr. Gorbachev. We must give him every help that we can, which I don't think will be a matter of doling out money. It'll be a matter of contacts and advice and keeping close to them, and probably very much advice on how to run a market economy, because that's what they're going to move towards. It's enormously exciting. He's a very great man. We must do all we can to help him.
Margaret Ewing.
Yes, I think this is a very interesting question, and we could discuss it all night, and I don't think there are very many easy solutions to the difficulties which will occur inevitably in the Soviet Union. I think we have to remember that President Gorbachev may be a hero here in the West, but he's faced by huge internal problems at home. There are the reactionary forces within his own organisation. There's a vast bureaucracy has been built up over decades, and these people are not willingly going to give up their own positions. And I think he is facing a real struggle. Additionally, people expected his reforms to put food in the stores, and that hasn't happened, and this is part of the lack of stability which exists at the moment. So bearing all that in mind, how do we help them? Well, much has already been touched on, and I don't want to repeat it. We've already seen extensive developments in trade with Russia over the last years, and I think that must be continued. On the military side, I think we have to proceed with cautious optimism. I can't think of a better way to describe it. I was certainly very concerned in the initial stages when we saw all the changes in Eastern Europe, that there seemed to be an attitude of retrenchment in elements of the West, that it was cosy and comfortable and understandable to have the Warsaw Pact as it always existed and NATO as it always existed. And I think we have to be optimistic in how we proceed now to see less money being spent on military matters and the money being diverted into the economy, because most surely that is one of the reasons that President Gorbachev has undertaken these reforms. The budget was just so huge that they couldn't provide the food and the commodities and the consumer goods that people in Russia wanted.
Do you think it's time for deep defence cuts here as well?
Well, I'm very pleased to see that the USA has started making moves towards the reduction in their forces in Europe to be met on an equal basis with what's happening in Russia. I certainly think we should be reviewing the whole prospect of Trident coming here, because, I mean, 4 submarines arriving at Coolport I don't think is going to be exactly a signal of the West actually responding positively to what is happening over there. And I do think we have to take that on board. And socially, yes, the contacts. And I would like to see a lot more people learning Russian in our schools, because I think the languages are so important.
Frank Dobson.
Well, like everybody else, as somebody who was born when Hitler was invading the Soviet Union and the Soviet people were fending them off and eventually defeating Hitler, I'm someone who can't in my grown life remember the Soviet Union being portrayed by most people in this country anyway as anything other than a giant menace that we'd all got to respond to, and a place which oppressed the human spirit. And I think everybody in the world feels a lifting of the human spirit to see that despite everything that went on within the Soviet Union, people's desire to be free and to determine their own destiny lives on, whatever the form of oppression that they face. And so I think everybody's excited by that. I think everybody admires what Gorbachev is trying to do, or nearly everybody, but he does face immense and daunting problems. And I think when we're thinking about what our response should be, we should look at the forces and the centers of power within the Soviet Union who are trying to obstruct him, or might obstruct him, or try to overthrow him. There are people who have a cushy number under the present regime. There are people who, by their forcing their nationalist aspirations too far, may cause trouble for him, and particularly to cause trouble with his defense and security industry, because it is a big industry, and he has a lot of military might and a lot of people with a big investment in military power. And what we do need to do is to try to make sure that there's nothing done by the West which gives them an excuse to say that he's got it wrong. Right. And they've been used, used to the idea of a barrier
like to hear the
between,
now, Frank, if I may.
Well,
can you?
I'm happy to hear the audience, but I heard some of the other people on the panel as well.
Well, I don't want to cut you off in mid-flow, but I would like to. I'll come back to you in a second.
Thank you.
Gentleman right at the back.
Some of the panel have made references to the difficulties that President Gorbachev is facing, and would the panel therefore agree that the West should only disarm in agreement with the Warsaw Pact rather than doing so unilaterally?
Would you like to pick up on that very briefly?
Well, I will pick up on that. The Soviet military strategy has been based on the belief that they had barrier states in Eastern Europe. And those barriers have disappeared, and they are now, I think, thrown in some confusion. And we've got to make sure that we don't do anything which makes them scared. And one of the things that scares me in these circumstances is the possibility of the United States or other people in the West actually encouraging breakaway movements within what is now the Soviet Union. Because if we get that sort of interference within the Soviet Union, then there is a great danger that the progressive forces within the Soviet Union will lose out to the reactionary forces who will blame the West and have an excuse for blaming the West and say we want to take over and we want to become a militaristic state again.
Lady in blue there with the hand up.
I was very interested to hear George Younger's enthusiasm and support for the nationalism currently being expressed in certain parts of the Soviet Union. Doesn't he think this is a touch hypocritical given his government's unwillingness to respect the wishes of the Scottish people and grant them any form of independence from Westminster?
I think we could talk about that all night. Right at the back.
Does George Younger foresee a possibility of cuts in government spending on defence?
Sorry, who were you asking that to?
George Younger.
Oh well, I think he probably covered that in his answer. The possibility of cuts in government spending on defence. Not yet was the message.
I should think we very much hope that the talks will lead to reductions on both sides, and that will enable us to reduce our forces too.
Now, Paddy Ashdown.
Yes, I agree with that. I mean, I actually think it's very important that we do multilaterally disarm at this moment, probably more than any other, because if you have a treaty base that brings you down, it's a treaty base that stops you going back up against afterwards. Peter, I wonder if I could just tell a little tiny story, very short. I met recently with a marshal of the Red Army who came to my office, and he had actually stood in an election, and we had a long conversation. And at the end, I hope you'll forgive my Russian accent, he said to me, "Mr. Ashdown, is very strange. Under Mikhail Gorbachev, we in the Soviet Union are getting more and more democratic. Under Mrs. Thatcher, you in Britain are getting less and less democratic." He said to me, I expect in years' time we shall cross over.
George Younger.
Very briefly, all I can say is, what a piece of cheek. We have absolutely free elections all the time and have had them for many years. Absolutely. No, it's not. It's not a joke.
Oh, well.
Absolutely free elections for many, many years. They have never had any free elections yet at all. What a piece of cheek. We're a democracy here.
Very sensitive.
Just a very, very brief one. When will we stop? When will the term the Soviet threat be obsolete?
Well, I don't think there is a Soviet threat today. I don't think it's credible that the Soviet Union wants to attack us today.
Is that now out of our political vocabulary?
At the moment it is, but don't forget that to build up defences takes a very long time. We cannot assume it would never be so. Let's reduce the armaments by agreement with them, and let's hope both sides can do it, and we can spend a lot less on them.
But Peter, we're still in a mad position where the rockets, we understand, are still targeted on Lech Walesa in Poland and President Havel in Czechoslovakia, and for all I know, they may be targeted at the moment. Our rockets on the people who are marching for democracy
Frank,
in Leipzig and Dresden. We do need to calm down a bit and make sure that, you know, I think this is exposing just what a mad situation and a dangerous situation we've been living in for decades.
Let's calm down and move on to a question from Mary Malloy, who is a teacher. Mary Malloy.
Peter, what are the panel's opinions on the ethics of research which involves the use of less than 14-day-old embryos?
Frank Dobson.
I believe that it is right for research to be carried out on embryos up to the period of 14 days, as proposed in the Warnock report. But that's not the whole answer. I think we need to go back to say, why do we need such research? Why is such research useful? There are about 1 in every 6 couples in Britain who are either infertile or subfertile. To be infertile or subfertile is very, very distressing. I'm someone who, with my wife, has been fortunate enough to have 3 children. Having children, most of the time, is a delight. To be denied that opportunity, I mean, they're all irritating from time to time, I know all that, but to be denied children if you want them can embitter relationships, break up relationships, ruin the happiest of personalities. And I think, as a society, we owe it to that 1 in 6 of all couples to do what we can to help them. Most people like the idea of test tube babies. Most people were thrilled when Louise Brown was first born. That was a good thing. We need more research to improve the number of people who can have test tube babies. We need more research to help reduce the number of ordinary miscarriages, and we need more research to reduce the amount of inherited disease. For all those reasons, I believe that this limited research, providing it's controlled by a statutory body, is right and proper and would benefit most people in this country.
And in very briefly, Frank, in your judgment, it's gone through the House of Lords today. What are its chances in the Commons on a free vote?
Well, last time, the Enoch Powell bill to prevent all that sort of thing got through the Commons, at least at its early stage, by a very substantial majority, I regret to say. But I hope in this case, for once in a while, the Commons will follow the example of the Lords.
Margaret Ewing.
Well, I wouldn't like to predict what the House of Commons will do, because I think this is a very difficult issue for members of Parliament, as it is for members of the public, because there's a whole series of issues come into it. But I've listened very carefully to the arguments which have been put forward on both sides of the case, and I do believe there is an argument for continuing pre-embryo research with a very strict limit of the 14 days. I think it is very important. Frank's already touched on the issue of infertility and the heartbreak that causes to couples. There's also the fact that we could look more closely at some congenital diseases and perhaps find ways of avoiding these for couples, again, for whom this can be a great heartbreak. I think we have to balance that up, and I do think that those of us who, for other reasons, may object to it, I think we have to understand each other's viewpoint. I believe we have great talent in this country amongst our geneticists and our scientists and the people involved. I've got the highest regard for the people already working on the Interim Licensing Authority, and I do believe that this would be very closely safeguarded. I don't think any of us would vote for it unless it were very closely safeguarded.
George Younger.
Well, it's all going to come back to this 14 days, which is a technical point, and even MPs doing their best are going to have to take the best technical advice they can. There are 2 principles I would like to see, and I don't think I disagree with the others, really. But the 2 principles, I may do. The 2 principles are, firstly, that I, like everyone else, would like to see everything possible done to help people who are infertile or births which are deformed and so on. And so anything we can do on that is marvellous. But I do, on the other hand, I feel very, very unhappy indeed about the principle of abortion. I don't like it at all. And therefore, there are 2 rather incompatible difficulty things here. That interference with an embryo is something I hate, and I would like to avoid it any way I can. So,
did you vote on the Enoch Powell bill?
No, I don't think I did. The question here is going to resolve it. Is the 14-day embryo really not yet describable as a person or not? I'm still taking advice on it. I'm told by many people that that is an okay division to make. But I'm still very unhappy about it. I'm going to have to take a lot of advice from constituents and others.
Paddy Ashdown.
Well, first of all, I very much hope that the bill does not get tangled up with abortion. They are two separate issues. Right. They are both very, very difficult issues, moral issues, practical issues. Secondly, let me say to George that I hope he does more, and I know him well enough to know that he will do more than just take technical advice. I mean, I tell you straight, Peter, this is the most difficult decision I have ever had to make as a Member of Parliament. My whole heart led me off saying no, 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 no. And I have spent the last 4 or 5 months, not all of it obviously, but reading up, talking to scientists, reading the New Scientist, speaking to clergymen in my constituency and others. And I have come to a conclusion, but I must bluntly say, although this may encourage another mountain of letters into my office, I must bluntly say that I find this such a difficult issue that my mind is not yet finally made up. But if I had to vote on it tomorrow, and it's a fair question to ask, I would vote in favour of the Warnock proposals. Because, I mean, the whole problem is establishing a line to draw. And the basis of the argument is whether this line is sustainable. There's a Chinese saying which says that a man's progress should not run ahead of his soul. And I think that's very, very important. In my judgment, and there are far too many technical arguments and moral arguments than we are able to have time to bring out in this programme, but in my judgment, the Warnock proposals approach a very, very difficult problem with great integrity and great skill and come to a conclusion which I am inclined to support.
Mary Malloy, you asked the question. What's your view?
Well, the research seems to me to be directed at not towards actually sorting out the problem of genetic defects occurring, but more to weeding out, and a weeding out of humanity and people seems to me to be unacceptable.
Right. Is there another view on this emotive topic? Lady in the front here, in the red.
I think it's fighting against the nature is not right, because the moment we try to fight against nature, we see the consequences, and I think Scotland is already watching consequences. So long as infertility, controlling the infertility and providing this happiness, what our friend just said, that having child is a great bliss, I think that should be shared. But when it comes to various other issues, when we bring children, somebody else's child and so on, I think that is going to create a lot of social complications later on. Perhaps those consequences should be seen in perspective.
Thank you very much. Gentleman there in the shirt sleeves.
I think we're spending a lot of money possibly changing what God had intended originally on this type of research. Yet there are people in the world who are dying daily because nobody is saying, here's a hand, let us feed you. Perhaps it's time now in our society to take the money in research and use it today to feed people who are dying today.
But I do say, I mean, really it would be a very dangerous thing if we were to take issues which were essentially moral in their nature, and that's what this is, and say that must be decided out on the question of a balance of what the practical results will be in comparison to somebody else. I mean, if we were to decide all moral issues on the basis that the money would be better spent elsewhere, I think we'd come to some pretty curious decisions. And it would be an odd case, in my view, if we were to say that we decided not to do this because it would enable us to do that. We have to make a decision now that science has given us this decision, which I'd much rather not have to make. We must make a decision about where the line has to be drawn. And it's on that I think you have to base your decision. How you spend the money should really be, in my judgment, a rather different issue.
And there's the lady up there at the back.
I think if some of the previous speakers had spoken to parents of children born with serious genetic disorders whom they've actually had to watch suffer and subsequently die, that they might have different views on the issue.
Is there another view? Someone take the opposite view? Lady there in the glasses.
I have to say that I'm fairly appalled by some of the views that have been expressed in the embryology bill tonight. I think that what we are seeing is people who will obstruct progress at any price. The fact remains that the quality of life for many parents or would-be parents will be greatly enhanced by research with embryology, that the quality of life for generations of future children who will not have the diseases that at the moment they now suffer will be greatly enhanced. And if you want to enhance the quality of life of children and adults, then you cannot, in all honesty, stand in a barrier against this type of research. And the other thing which is creeping into this whole debate, which very much worries me, is that a very powerfully motivated anti-abortionist lobby
which is seeking to use the embryology bill as a backdoor method of reintroducing an amendment to further reduce women's rights to abortion. The debate over abortion and the debate around research on embryology involve completely different sets of moral standards, a completely different debate, and should not be allowed to be taken together in the House of Commons in one single piece of legislation.
Well, we're in the last 5 minutes of question time tonight, and I have to move on because the clock goes faster than you think. I'd like to call another questioner, Martin McGovern, who is a teacher.
Good evening. Wrens are now able to serve on warships, and girls are able to join the Scouts. Which of these two will most promote equal opportunities?
Frank Dobson.
Well, I understand that the Guides Association have not really been consulted by the Scouts about opening the Scouts up to women, so I think, or to girls.
The Guides to boys.
Well, yes, but I really think the Scouts ought to bear in mind what the women's organisation thinks before they come to some unilateral decision. But generally speaking, it seems to me it's a good thing if women are allowed to do anything that men are allowed to do, providing the women want to do it.
Paddy Ashdown. Not many women in the Marines yet.
Jolly good thing if there were. I mean, I'd hesitate to. I wouldn't dream of choosing between the two. I would say this, Peter, that I actually think that we are now seeing a fundamental change in the nature of our society and probably in the way we run our economy too. It may well be a shift of a 1,000-year shift. And it is this that I think we are now seeing a position where women will not just enjoy equality, but in many of the things that will be required in the new economics and the new marketplace, flexibility, a capacity to be able to do several jobs at once, the ability to be able to run jobs on the basis and do work on the basis not of confrontation but of working together. Many of the gifts that women have are actually going to be more valuable in the future than some of the gifts that men have. And we may be seeing a fundamental shift to give women almost an ascendancy in the job marketplace. And if this country takes the right steps to liberate that potential, as these two moves are, then I'm absolutely delighted.
George Younger, it took your successor to put the women at sea.
Yes, and
officially, anyway.
It did indeed, but I can claim that it was we who set up the 3 studies in each service to find out how this could be done. It's absolutely marvellous news. I think the ladies in the services have been an enormous success. They've done nothing but good for them. They're extremely good soldiers, sailors and air women, and they'll be very, very good at sea on the ships. They can't obviously go into the very front line because of the physical strains involved. As far as the Scouts and the Guides are concerned, all in favour of them sorting it out too, but this has got to be sorted out by the Scouts and the Guides. They're a sister movement. Surely they can get their act together.
Margaret Ewing.
Well, on the basis that the younger people are, when they appreciate equality, perhaps the Guides and the Scouts is the best one if I had to choose. But I do believe there's a great deal more being needed in society, being needed to be done to ensure that there is real equality of opportunity for men and women. And that involves spending money on establishing nursery places, ensuring that there are creche facilities available, that we don't just pay lip service to saying, isn't it wonderful, here we are, women in the Wrens, girls, Guides and the Scouts, that we actually do something in society to ensure that more women come through and are real equals. And after all, they do let women into Parliament now, Peter.
Mr. McGovern, you can have the last word.
Taking it clearly, but if the choice is to be made, I think the Scouts is the most important.
Well, I tell a lie because, as ever, the clock has the last word. But my thanks to a splendid audience here in the City Hall in Glasgow. It's been a great pleasure to be in your great city. And next week, we shall be back in London, and around the table with me then will be the Right Honourable Kenneth Clarke, QC, MP, Secretary of State for Health, Margaret Beckett, MP, Shadow Chief Secretary to the Treasury, Nina Temple, Secretary of the Communist Party of Great Britain, and Dr. Madsen Piri, President of the Adam Smith Institute. That's in next Thursday's Question Time at 10 p.m. on BBC One. Thank you for watching, and to you all, a very good night.